Hello and welcome to another edition of Ideological. I'm your host, Zach Lee, and today we have a special guest. I have Benjamin Watkins from Real Atheology here with us. Ben, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Man, I'm really excited about this topic. If this is your first time watching Ideological, it's a pretty true free speech platform. So we interview people from different walks of life, different worldviews, all kinds of stuff. And today we're going to be talking about atheism. And so before we jump in there, Ben, I want to turn it over to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about your upbringing, how you became an atheist, and specifically about Real Atheology. One of the things that I really enjoy about that is it promotes open dialogue in an academic way that's not hostile. Because I've seen a lot of people that are religious that are just mudslinging, and then I've seen people that are non-religious mudslinging. You guys do a good job of really having true debate. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I grew up in a conservative Quaker-like community in Columbia, South Carolina. And so it's often called the 2x2s or the truth. And so it's more or less a non-denominational kind of house church. And probably in my early to mid-20s, I started to, I had graduated from college. I was looking into things like personal finance and looking at buying an engagement ring, like all the things that you do, like once you graduate college, and you're like, okay, how do I get my life in order and become an adult? And so one of those big questions was what my faith involved. And so I just started asking different questions. I was kind of at a crossroads with my faith. I was dating someone who is now my wife, and she was raised Catholic. So there was
you just celebrated an anniversary, right? Didn't you just celebrate an anniversary?
Yeah, we just had
congratulations.
We called it our Transformerversary because I asked her out to see Transformers 2. Maybe not the best movie to take someone on a date on, but I'm really glad she said yes.
It worked. I mean, it worked. You got her.
It worked. Yeah. So I was really trying to understand, like, hey, am I going to like convert to Catholicism? Am I going to kind of double down on the faith that I was raised in? And so I just started asking questions about, hey, what are the differences between the Catholic faith and the Protestant faith that I was brought up in, and just kind of, started pulling on strings. And as this was kind of in the heyday of YouTube, right before streaming services came about, about 2010-ish time frame. So like there was a lot of apologetics things available on YouTube, as well as sites like Closer to Truth. And then I bought some books. And so as I started to dive into that hole, my faith kind of just started to erode. And so I guess there's really been three big pillars of that erosion. And they were there from the beginning, and I guess they've always kind of they've just stuck with me through my philosophy journey. As much as everything else has fluctuated, those three reasons kind of stood out. And so the first was just the obvious issue of religious pluralism. So this idea that the world is religiously ambiguous. There's widespread religious disagreement, and that just seemed surprising, given a particular theistic tradition, whereas that seemed like something expected on, like an atheism or a materialistic naturalism. The second big reason was the problem of evil. So in the apologetics resources that I was, diving into, they always address, no matter what they were talking about, they always had something to say about the problem of evil. So I knew it was a problem, and I would just really found myself dissatisfied with the replies that there were to that problem. So that was a big one that kind of stuck out. And then the third one is kind of the methodological naturalism bit about, the secular success of science. So science just seems to have progressed since the Enlightenment, and it's done so on secular grounds. So we just didn't need, it seemed like our best explanatory theorizing just didn't need to make use of theistic concepts. And again, I thought that was pretty surprising, but given theism, but a matter of course, given an atheism or materialistic naturalism. And so probably around 2011, 2012-ish, I kind of came to terms with the fact I was like, okay, well, my having gone through an agnostic period, I was like, I think I'm in the atheist camp. But then I was really just deep into philosophy, and I discovered moral philosophy. I discovered philosophy of science. I discovered philosophy of mind. And so I was just kind of off to the races with that. And then around 2017, it was probably about 2016, I met Justin Schieber, who was at the time of the podcast Reasonable Doubts. And so when that project disbanded, he started what was called Real Atheology. And so after some correspondences back and forth, he invited me on to be one of the co-hosts. And so we've been doing the Real Atheology podcast ever since. And so what we want to do with that project is exactly what you were describing. So it makes me feel good to hear that people are taking away from it what we intend. And that's to explore questions in the philosophy of religion in a way that is both rigorous, but also accessible to people on both atheist and theistic sides. We want to expose kind of the intellectual side of the atheist philosophy of religion, because we think that both atheists and theists have something to benefit from that in their philosophical journeys. And we feel like we were filling in kind of a niche in the internet that really just, there was the new atheism on one side, and then there were, kind of the atheist podcasters on the other side. But we didn't really feel like there was this really serious engagement with the best arguments on the other side of the aisle, as well as there seemed to be a lot of burden of proof dodging and, kind of bad faith, it felt like, on our own side. And so we wanted to raise the level of discourse and not only model what we think that committed atheists should aspire to be in what they're in their world building, but also to give theists something to interact with, because it really felt like there was a lot of theists, real apologists out there that had studied arguments and that they really wanted to engage with an intellectual side, on the other side of this, and they had to go, far and wide to try to find that. So we wanted to fill that hole, so to speak.
That's great. I appreciate you sharing that. That's super helpful. Yeah, I've seen with Real Atheology, there's a real desire to actually have good arguments, find truth. It's not just the mudslinging. It's not just the support my camp. I mean, it was even approved of by, I think I saw a blurb from William Lane Craig and some other stuff on y'all's website. And so also another thing that Ben and I have in common, we both love David Hume, and we both have pictures of Albert Camus in our offices. I have one too. So I'm a big Myth of Sisyphus and Stranger guy. So very cool. Okay, so I think most people know what atheism is. Obviously, but chat with us a little bit about, is that term even a fair label? It's one of those things when you talk about presuppositions and kind of switching the burden of proof, and sorry if it gets loud, it just started raining here. Switching the burden of proof and this kind of stuff. Is that even a fair term? Because it's defining a movement in response to another movement, but that then assumes that theism's the default, and theism might not necessarily be the default. Chat with us a little bit about the type of atheism you mean. We're not talking about Victorian atheism. We're not talking about the new atheism with Dawkins and Dennett and Hitchens and those guys. This is a more kind of thoughtful, engaging, I think you guys mentioned friendly atheism. Give me your thoughts on all that.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So first off, yeah, I think atheism is very much a fair term. And so I will be honest with you, I'm kind of bewildered by a lot of the animosity and weird redefinition of atheism. So, and I think you're right to want to kind of distinguish us from new atheism, and also kind of the atheism of the Enlightenment. So, a lot of, people who were very clearly not atheists in the sense that we mean, like Spinoza or
Diderot,
David Hume. Yeah. Hobbes, these were people who were very much accused of being atheists. But I think that there was a very real sense in which they were theists. And so we want to distinguish ourselves from those Enlightenment theists who were unfairly
They're mainly
charged.
deistic. They're mainly deistic. That's different. Yeah. Yep.
And the kind of new atheist, the term I use is lack theist. Essentially not, the non-theist definition of atheist and kind of steer a middle ground in what my co-hosts and people at part of my project, we like to kind of call friendly atheism or old atheism. And in the sense that we just deny that there are any gods. And so we just kind of see it as a simple, we can raise the question, does God exist or not? And it's kind of a binary question. And so if you take one side, if you take the positive side of this question, if you say there is a God or there are gods or there is some sort of deity, then you're a theist. And if you negate that claim, you're an atheist. And then if you think that the question is somehow indeterminate or unanswerable, then you're an agnostic. And then that the term non-theist can just be used for someone who's not a theist. So atheists and agnostics are both non-theists. But we really think that the position that is interesting is the atheist position. That's the position that we think that our apologetics peers on the other side of this, they want to engage with. They want to understand. And it's what we want to see people online who are skeptical of traditional religious beliefs to kind of have a familiarity with and use in their repertoire of arguments and skepticism instead of just kind of playing the non-theistic route. And so I guess I kind of have, I've kind of become known as the guy who defends this rigorous definition of atheism, which I'll be honest with you, is a little embarrassing. That's not exactly what I don't want to be the guy known for a definition. I'd like to be the guy known for, an interesting argument. And so I've tried to combine that. I've tried to give an interesting argument for the definition of atheism. And so that argument roughly goes like this, that theism should be defined as the proposition that God exists. And so I think that's acceptable to theists. I think that's acceptable to atheists. It's theists who are saying God exists. And so if you say God exists, you are a theist. The second premise is that atheism should be defined in terms of theism. So if there were no theism, if you didn't have a concept of theism, then there would be no atheism. And I think most people agree, on both sides of this agree. Yeah, like if there were no theists in the world, then the idea of having an atheist just seems kind of silly. And then the third premise, the final premise, is that the proposition that God exists is not the psychological condition of believing there is a God. It's a claim, it's a proposition. It can be either true or it can be false. And so from these three premises, it follows that atheism should not be defined as the absence or lack of the psychological condition of believing that God exists.
Yeah, we're talking about reality. We're not just talking about psychologism in our heads.
No one's really interested in what it is that you lack a belief in.
That's right.
The interesting question is the proposition, does God exist or not? Like, is that
That's
true or is that false? So there are reasons to fall on either side of this question. There's a technical sense of the term theory. The atheists are very quick to point this out. Like if you use the term theory in a very fast and loose sense, especially when in context of evolution, they'll remind you there's a technical sense of theory. And so I think there's a technical sense of atheism here. I think that if we should be using the technical sense of and the historical sense of the term, and if we're straying away from that, I think we're inviting opportunities for confusion and for people to talk past each other, and those just aren't interesting discussions.
Agreed. That was a very helpful definition. I do appreciate the clarifiers. Okay, that's mainly introduction. Let's talk about the fun stuff. Many people have a false presupposition when they think of someone as an atheist. Can you chat with us about what some of those false presuppositions are, why they're misperceived? I mean, because I think a lot of people, if you go back like 60 years ago and you hear someone's an atheist, you must assume that maybe they're immoral or maybe they're angry or whatever. And then, I talk to you and I'm like, this guy's delightful. And so, you know what I mean? So I think there's a lot of misconceptions around an atheist doesn't have a moral standard or an atheist. And I've heard friends of mine that are very religious be like, oh, I think atheism's dumb. And I'm like, listen, it is an extremely coherent worldview. You can't just dismiss it like that. So chat with us about some of the misperceptions people have of atheism and atheists in our culture and maybe why those are like that.
Yeah, so I certainly think that the first one that you mentioned is probably the big one, that somehow, atheists are immoral or lack values, or angry, bitter, nihilistic, even. Certainly other misconceptions, I think, are that atheists like secretly believe in something. They're somehow self-deceiving themselves, or they're merely rebellious for its own sake. You certainly hear people say, well, they just love to sin. And so like the atheism is just a way to, bring out the love of their sin. That atheists are somehow intolerant or close-minded of people who are of religious faith. So in some way that they, want to persecute religious believers, or that atheists want to eradicate religion. Like if they had, they could, they would just eliminate religion from the world, and that the world would be a better place if they did that. So with saying, I guess I've kind of poisoned the well a little bit here by saying that these are misconceptions. But in one sense, I want to be fair to the other side in the sense that these are not always misconceptions. So I'm sure that, there's certainly a minority of atheists who fit some description like that. Some atheists, I'm sure, really are immoral, nihilistic, rebellious, intolerant, want to eradicate traditional religion. I've certainly heard new atheist types say things like this. So they're certainly not helping the case that I want to make that these are largely misconceptions. But I think that these are a minority, though there's a very vocal minority that have beliefs like this. But I really think that the driver for these misconceptions are really just kind of everyday facts about religion. So we live in a religiously dominant society. So religion plays a very central role in culture. And rejection of that can seem threatening or abnormal. So if it's a norm, and you buck that norm, well, then by definition, you're abnormal. And so that's just where that kind of sticks. Because it's such a minority, there's a lack of exposure. If you're within religious circles, going outside of that circle, you might not encounter people who are openly atheists. And so, stereotypes just kind of fill that gap. Media portrayals, certainly. So popular media often depicts atheists as, villains, caricatures, bitter skeptics. And so kind of reinforcing those stereotypes.
Yeah, you don't want that. You want the Ricky Gervais. You want the lighthearted, funny, engaging. Yeah.
I also think that it has something to do. This has to do with philosophy in general. So not necessarily atheists, but philosophy more generally. There's a general part of human nature that there's a fear of uncertainty. So uncertainty, I think, makes people uncomfortable. Doubting makes people uncomfortable. And so religious belief systems provide existential security, and atheism's lack of supernatural assurances can seem unsettling, cold, distant, abnormal.
I mean, that's Freud and Feuerbach. I mean, Freud and Feuerbach have the thesis that is you are creating that safety blanket of taking your dad, making him big so you feel better.
Yeah. I'm not saying that this is the primary driver, but I think it's at least one contributing factor. And then, of course, the classic, group identity. So there's in-groups and there's out-groups. And so with religion, there's an in-group, and they form a social identity. And so, disbelief can be misread as a betrayal or a moral failure of atheists. And so, I think those are probably the biggest contributors to the misconceptions surrounding atheists. And of course, us in the atheist camp who think about these sort of things seriously and are, many of us have very religious family members. Many of our best friends are of theist persuasion. Its conversations are much more interesting with people that you disagree with than if what you agree with. And so we can't help but chuckle at a lot of these misconceptions, and certainly I think our theist friends, kind of roll their eyes and, like, okay, well, clearly my atheist friends aren't like, you need to get out more. Like my atheist friends aren't like that at all. And so hopefully we're playing our small little part with real atheology and kind of, undoing those misconceptions in the best way we can.
Yes. Thank you. Helpful clarifiers. Okay. Can you chat with us a little bit about some the next two questions I'll just kind of combine and you can take it wherever you want. Can you chat with us a little bit about some positive arguments for atheism? And then conversely, can you chat with us a little about some negative arguments against theism? So I think in the atheism versus theism conversation, there's both the defending and building a case for yourself, and then there's the polemics of poking holes in kind of the other side. And so I think a lot of people probably listening to this have not heard, hey, I want to hear a case for atheism, but I also want to hear problems with theism. Most people don't think about things like this, but they should. And then when they do, typically it's a quickly written off answer or something because they just want to stay in their camp. Give me some of your thoughts on positive and negative when it comes to, positive for atheism, and then maybe some of the problems that you see with theistic arguments.
Yeah, sure. So first off, I think you're exactly right to kind of make the distinction that you did in the sense that there's on the one side, the building of a positive worldview, and then there's kind of the critique of the theistic case, because there's a potential pitfall here. If we've defined atheism as disbelief in theism, positive arguments for atheism and negative arguments for theism are going to be one and the same argument. So an argument for atheism is going to be an argument against theism. And an argument against theism is going to be an argument for atheism. So if we want to cash this distinction out in something, distinct, I think you're exactly right that we have to look at one side as building up positive cases, a positive worldview, whereas the other side of this is trying to critique what is often called natural theology. And even there's potential pitfalls here because natural theology isn't the only camp on the other side. So there's three main traditions on the theistic side. So there's the natural theology side, which says that, through human reason alone, through something like science, we can discover theologically significant truths about God. So this is where you're going to find things like ontological arguments, cosmological arguments, teleological arguments, moral arguments.
All the things that Hume addresses in his dialogues concerning natural religion, basically.
Exactly. So natural religion, natural theology, those are going to be kind of go hand in hand. But there's two other important traditions that I think are certainly worth mentioning. So there's what's often called the presuppositionalist.
That's the Reformed apologetics. Start off with God's belief, Alvin Plantinga stuff.
Well, not quite Alvin Plantinga, but I see why we would get there. But he
identified himself as a Reformed epistemologist in the presupposition thing. But I know what you mean. He's not the same as the rest.
Yeah, he's not like a Van Tilian or a Greg Bahnsen, or so they're following in the footsteps of Kant. So Immanuel Kant has this famous transcendental idealism and is saying like, look, there's these categories of the mind. They're like glasses that we can't take off. And so we just can't help but see the world in things like space, time, causation. And so one of those categories of the mind is going to be Christian theism. And so that if you were to take Christian theism out of the picture, well, then your worldview is reduced to absurdity. It would be like taking space, time, or causation out of your system. And then the third tradition would be kind of a mystical tradition or Reformed epistemology position like Alvin Plantinga's position where, look, argument and evidence are not necessary for the rationality of belief. So we can be directly aware of religious reality through a special faculty of the mind, what he calls a sensus divinitatis. So we can come into direct contact. So even the most lay person who is completely unfamiliar with philosophy or epistemology or science more generally, even they can have an understanding of and knowledge of God just because of this faculty. And so I think there's one tradition of atheism that's going to be skeptical of these theistic traditions, and they're going to offer responses to things like the ontological argument, They're going to cosmological, teleological, moral argument. They're going to engage with those arguments. They're going to try to build up a system of rationality that doesn't involve Christian theism, or they're going to have some sort of not reformed theology, but just standard epistemology, where there isn't this special, there is no sensus divinitatis. But what I think is much more interesting, because you can find Christians who disagree with one another on reformed epistemology versus natural theology, versus presuppositionalism. So there's already good conversations having in-house among theists. What I think theists really want is what you initially talked about, that positive case for atheism. And I've already kind of hinted at it with the three reasons, that kind of eroded my faith. So the first is the problem of evil. So that's kind of the big dog in the house, in the sense that if you're a philosophically informed theist who's writing in any capacity about the rationality of theism, you have to say something about the problem of evil.
And I would say that's probably the biggest one. Would you agree that that is
the biggest one? It's certainly the one
that's the hardest one.
It's the biggest stumbling block. Practically, when you find people who were formerly believers and they've lost their faith, majority of the time they're going to say some variation of a problem of evil. And so I think that's kind of the big dog in the house. And it's in one way misleading because it makes it sound like there's a single problem. Whereas like cosmological and teleological arguments, there's a family of arguments. And so there's different ways of dividing them. Different things claim to accomplish different things by taking different facts for granted. The second one is probably the second most cited one, is the problem of religious ambiguity. So what's often called the problem of divine hiddenness. So this idea that God seems hidden, or at least his existence is ambiguous in a way that causes all of this religious disagreement. And so again, something has to be said in response to that, but also the atheist needs to put forward some sort of positive argument. What does an argument from religious ambiguity look like? And then I think that there's the natural success of science. So the secular success of the natural sciences, I should say. So there's what's often called methodological naturalism. So it's this idea that unless it's a last resort, we're not going to make use of supernatural explanations, because supernatural explanations have such a poor track record from the Enlightenment.
Yeah, if you get appendicitis, you don't pray, you go to the hospital.
Yeah. So exactly. So and so that's just surprising, though. We would have thought that as science unfolded, we would have to take into account divine actions, or the actions of unembodied spirits, or the efficacy of prayer. Like, this would just be a variable in our research that just, in the last analysis, doesn't seem to be one. But again, what that argument actually looks like and actually amounts to, this is where the atheist has some more work. And so one of the areas where I've done work in atheist philosophy of religion is to give another argument. So there's those three main ones, but I actually just recently contributed to a debate book where I wrote a chapter on what I call the argument from material minds. So it's the idea that mental causation, the idea that minds influence the world, implies that our minds are at least physically dependent on an embodied brain. And so that this is some evidence for atheism against theism, because on theism, we would have expected that our minds could exist entirely independently of anything material, and so that we would have had an immaterial soul. And so it's basically the old hat of trying to resolve dualism versus materialism in the philosophy of mind. And that
freaking Descartes, dude, he's so smart. I just need him to solve it.
Yeah.
But you don't appeal to the pineal gland, though. You have something that's a little more informed.
Yeah. So, but it's basically, so if you were to go into talk to a philosopher of mind, or you were to go into a neuroscience department, so you're going to have to search far and wide to find a committed dualism. So dualism's fallen on hard times. It's had something of a resurgence in the past 30 years or so. But most philosophers of mind, neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, psychologists, are some form of what's called ontological physicalist. So now you can divide that up further. There's property dualism, there's neutral monism. There's a whole gambit of just different views within the philosophy of mind, and certainly a lot of room for disagreement. But what all philosophers of mind generally agree on is that minds are spatially located. So my mind is here in Virginia. Your mind is there. I'm not actually sure where you're located. What I do know
I'm in Texas, in Dallas, under a storm right now. Yeah. So yes, that's what we have.
Your
here.
mind is located in Texas. My mind is located in Virginia. They're spatially located, and so that spatial location is a physical property. So our minds are at least dependent on one physical property, space.
Let me clarify something just for that, and just in case some of the people watching aren't as familiar. In philosophy, we distinguish between mind and brain. Brain is the gray matter in your head that weighs a certain number of pounds. Mind has to do with your conscious experiences. So if you think of a pink elephant and we do an MRI, we don't see that pink elephant in your brain because it supposedly is not physical. But if that's the case, how can it move your physical body? How can you interact, et cetera? So one of the things that Benjamin's talking about is trying to understand the material aspects of how the mind is dependent upon the brain, and i.e. physicality. Like you said, if my mind is not spatial, if it's immaterial, then why is it not away from me?
Yeah.
Right.
Or, like I can raise my hand, but like, why can't I raise your hand? And so you can't say, well, because you're in Texas and I'm in Virginia. Right. Well, but if minds aren't spatially located, that shouldn't be a relevant difference.
It wouldn't matter. Yeah, it'd be Wi-Fi.
Now, I'm not saying that this argument is decisive. So I very quickly admit that this is what's called a prima facie reason. So you might say that, look, there's other evidences. Like this might be a chip that falls in the atheist camp, but there's all these other chips that fall in the theist camp. And so I would certainly concede that it's not a decisive argument. It's not what's called an all things considered conclusion. So those are the four arguments that I would want to mention for atheism: the argument from evil, widespread religious disagreement, or what's called the problem of divine hiddenness, the secular success of the natural sciences, and then the argument from physical minds. And so I think those are, four pretty good arguments to be an atheist or a naturalist, metaphysical naturalist. So the idea that the material world is causally closed. There's nothing from outside of the material world that comes in and bumps around and moves stuff in the material world. But the other side of the coin, we mentioned arguments from natural theology. So what does it look like to argue against theism? And so I think that really starts, again, with, I've already mentioned Immanuel Kant once, so I might as well mention him again. So we have a division of arguments that we kind of inherit from Kant. And he divides them into ontological arguments, cosmological arguments, teleological arguments, and moral arguments. And so why does he divide them up this way? And so I think he actually has a pretty good reasons for dividing them up the way he does. So the ontological argument tries to argue for God from pure concepts. So he tries to take things like definitions, things that are known, what's called a priori, prior to experience, and moving from the idea of God to the existence of God. The cosmological argument starts from the idea of general existence. So the idea that there's something rather than nothing. The whole of reality is contingent, and so then tries to infer the existence of God from that very general fact, and that God is the sustaining cause of the world, or it is his choice that creates the world. He's the first cause of the world.
Yeah, taking us today and going backwards, there is cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect. If it goes on forever, we'd never get here today. So there has to be, what Aristotle would call an unmoved mover kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Or God is the sufficient reason why there is something rather than nothing, so you could appeal to something like the principle of sufficient reason. So ontological argument, this idea that, essence kind of implies existence. Cosmological argument, no, we infer God's essence from existence. So it's not that essence implies existence, we infer his essence from the existence. And then the teleological argument is that there, instead of the general fact of essence, there are these particular facts that are best explained by the agency or intention of God. So, the universe is ordered the way it is, or biological organisms have the features that they do because God chose for them to have it and willed them to be. And then there's the moral argument. So you had from concepts, existence, particular causal facts about the world, but then there are these non-causal facts about value. And there's, again, a family of arguments here. So the one Kant uses specifically is that there's this, what's called the dualism of practical reason. So it seems that self-interest and impartial benevolence are kind of on a collision course. So is it always going to be in my self-interest to act moral? What aligns that? And so he gave God that role. He brings into accord self-interest and morality. Others are probably more familiar with William Lane Craig's moral argument, the idea that God is the ground of moral value and moral duty, or what's often it's kind of a variation of a teleological argument, but moral knowledge. So the idea that we can reliably come to moral knowledge. God has designed the world so in such a way that we can have reliable moral knowledge. God writes the moral law in our heart, kind of thing. And so I think those are the big four arguments that I think atheists need to have. Like, one, they need to be able to articulate what they believe to be the strongest formulation of each of those arguments. And I don't mean like an obviously false, everything has a cause, God, everything that exists has a cause. God exists, so God has a cause.
Right.
No, that's not the strongest form of a cosmological.
Yeah, don't straw man it. Don't straw man it. Yeah.
Don't do that. But then there's an honorable mention that I would throw in there, and that's the argument from religious experience. So that at the end of the day, a lot of people, the rationality of their belief doesn't hinge on these abstract philosophical arguments. It hinges on what people perceive to be religious experiences. And so I think that you have to, one, be able to formulate what an argument from religious experience would look like, and you're going to have to give some sort of natural history of religion. You're going to have to explain why it is that people have religious experiences at all, because, religious experiences are surprising given atheism or naturalism. And so now you might tell some story, and psychological story, you might tell some evolutionary story. You have to say something. Because most people are religious, and through most of history, people have had religious experiences. And so it's a phenomena that I don't think you can ignore. So you might not be able to classify it in those other four arguments. That's why I put it as kind of an honorable mention, because it usually gets turned into what Alvin Plantinga, what we mentioned, it's our sensus divinitatis. We have religious experiences, and that's our sensus divinitatis. So it might not even itself be an argument. It's, we don't have an argument against external world skepticism. We just believe there is an external world. Something similar could
solipsism or whatever. Yeah.
So just like we can believe solipsism is false, even though if we don't have a knockdown argument against it, we can believe that our religious experiences are veridical, even if we don't have a knockdown argument for the veridicality of our religious experiences. So I think the atheist has an epistemic duty to say something about that.
I love it. That's super helpful. I actually one time drove Alvin Plantinga to the airport, and I was trying to push on his epistemology pretty strong, because it doesn't really need rationality. It just starts with being true.
What he calls properly basic.
That's right. Yeah, properly basic beliefs. Your mental cognitive faculties are working correctly, even if you don't have a proof for it, for the same reason that you can say you had breakfast this morning, knowing that you don't have to have Cartesian certainty to do so. Of those arguments I'm going to jump down to another question here in a second, because I think it's helpful. Of those arguments you mentioned, So you're right, the big four, and then there's other ones we can throw in, but teleological, moral, ontological, and cosmological. Which ones do you think are the strongest, or what do you think the strongest case for theism is? And then which ones do you think are not as, because there's a response to each of those. So Kant saying that being can't be predicated, it's assumed, or in the ontological, or Hume saying that just because there's causation within a system, that doesn't allow you to jump and say there's causation of the whole system. Or teleology, where if you look around at the world, some of it looks great and some of it looks super messed up. And so there's all kinds of issues. Which ones do you think are stronger, not strong? Maybe the strongest case you think for theism isn't that, like you said, maybe it's religious experience, maybe it's that sensus divinitatis from Calvin, and then obviously others quoted after him. What do you think?
So I kind of want to split this question up into two, because I think, so if we were to ask, like, what argument do I think has the most potential to convince me to be a theist? Because at the end of the day, I want to be a theist. So I think that there's something to be said about an infinitely loving being who wants to have a meaningful relationship with you of infinite value. Like, that sounds like a pretty good deal. May not be on the board with the whole infinite life thing, because that might turn into infinite boredom. But under the assumption that there would be an infinitely non-bored relationship, I feel pretty on board with this idea. So I think the argument from religious experience is the one that's has the most potential to convert me. Because I think that if I were to have this really cogent religious experience, that's something that would move me. I tell this story frequently. In 2017, I had the opportunity to witness a total solar eclipse. And so I traveled back home to see it, and just to tell the people in your audience, like, I'm aware that you've seen solar eclipses in textbooks and on television. What you see in real life is not captured in the slightest by any video camera or camera, anything. Like, when you experience it, it is unlike any other experience that you've had. And I remember just being dumbstruck by the experience of seeing this thing. I don't know if you've experienced seeing a total solar.
We had one actually in the Dallas area about a year ago where it's totally out. The crickets start chirping. The weather gets cooler. It's insane.
So you did see it. So you know exactly what
Yeah, so, it is like once in a lifetime. It's powerful.
Yeah, very highly recommend seeing it if you get the chance. But I do know, or at least I believe, if I had seen that 500 years ago, and I didn't know what that was, I would have been like, God is very real and he is very pissed, and we are like, that would have absolutely like, I would have been awestruck, and it would have been just nothing but terror that followed that. So I think I'd experience like something like that. Like, if I were, like Hamlet, and I saw this ghost of my father sort of deal, and he was, telling me about how my father, had been murdered by my uncle. That's probably going to move me. But now, short of that, what do I think is the strongest argument? Not necessarily the one that has the most potential to change my mind, but what I think on philosophical grounds alone is the strongest, brings me right back to David Hume and his dialogues concerning natural religion, and it's the argument from design. So I think in his dialogues, there's what's often called Hume's strange inversion. So he spends all this time beating up Cleanthes and his natural theology, only to, at the end of that dialogue, say that he is a theist or an attenuated deist of sorts, and that there's some resemblance to human artifacts in the world, in nature. And so that the argument from design succeeds to some extent. And I think I have to go back and check it, but it's either in section 3 or section 4 of the dialogue. Cleanthes makes the point to Hume that there's just seems something natural about the idea that the world is designed and that it resembles designed art. It just strikes us with the force of something that's designed. And if you look throughout the dialogues, Philo doesn't really have Cleanthes puts forward a regular design argument and this irregular design argument. And so Philo smashes this regular design argument. But he doesn't have much to say about that irregular design argument. And I think there's something to be said about that irregular design argument. And I think Hume saw it too. And I think that's what explains Hume's strange inversion at the end of design arguments. And I also think it's what creationists latch onto and really play on the force of that. They'll, put something up and they'll go, look how a bumblebee is able to fly and pollinate these flowers, and look how, DNA is coded in these exact sequences, and there's a specified complexity or irreducible complexity, and it just strikes us with the force of something that seems designed. And so I think there's something to be said. I think that's a very powerful intuition. And so I think that gives, if I had to say which one has the most force philosophically, I would give it to the argument from design.
I appreciate that. And just to also recap for the audience. So in Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, one of the things that Hume points out, though, is the only kind of creator you can infer is the one from what you see, which means you can't infer an infinite being. You only see what's finite. You can't infer one God. You only see things that are plural. You can't, have a perfectly intelligent God because you have a messed up world. And if you say it's messed up because of sin, you've done a circular argument. So, but you're right. At the end, Hume is pretty good at being like, listen, I've got all these doubts and I've got all these questions, but it's not perfect. I don't know what to do with this thing. And he also kind of wants to save his butt and be a professor at Edinburgh. But that's
But intelligent
fair.
Design advocates pretty much, I think, are on the same page with Hume on this. And so they go, look, we might not be able to know much about the intelligent designer. He might just be like what all you said. He might be finite. He might be doing his best. He might be some dotted, attenuated deity who's ashamed of the product that he's made. But we can still get to an intelligent designer. There still
seems to be telos, purpose, right? We don't just say birds fly south and therefore avoid the winter. We say they do that in order to avoid the winter. Like we try. Yeah. So you're right. Okay.
It's natural in our language.
Yeah, it is. Okay. Let me ask you this one, because you've also done a lot of work in this area, and I saw some of your stuff online that I thought was fascinating. Tell me, what is your view of ethics, and what are some ethical systems that work within an atheistic worldview? I think people think if you don't have divine command theory, which runs into the Euthyphro dilemma anyway, that you don't have any system of ethics or whatever, but you've come up with a pretty cogent and strong ethical system. Can you chat with us a little bit about atheism and ethics?
Yeah, so first I want to say that, so I think that any ethical system works within an atheistic worldview, except those systems that are explicitly theologically based.
Yeah, so utilitarianism and deontology and all that would still work, yeah.
Yeah. So my own ethical persuasions are realist or objectivist. And I'm most sympathetic to Plato. I'll mention Kant again, Immanuel Kant, and the utilitarian Henry Sidgwick. More contemporarily, people like Derek Parfit, Tim Scanlon, John Rawls, the famous Veil of Ignorance. And so at the end of the day, what I think that morality is grounded in, what morality consists of, the parts of morality, so to speak, are reason and fairness. So reason broadly, so the standards of rationality, and fairness by what I mean by impartial deliberation. And so a moral point of view is one that's consistent with reason and does not endorse arbitrary partiality. So on my view, kind of the slogan form is to be moral is to be fair, and to be fair is to be rational. So fair deliberation is the bridge from rational thought to moral action. And so I take myself as following in the footsteps of Plato, Kant, and Sedgwick, in that, and even to an extent David Hume, even though David Hume and I don't share the same meta-ethics. I think he gets that part wrong. There is a place for reason and impartiality in his system of ethics as well. And so I recently did a debate with a friend of mine, Darwin to Jesus, on secular.
I saw that on Twitter, now X, but yeah.
Yeah, now X.
It's like a 4-hour debate or something. You guys are going.
Yeah. Well, so Darwin and I, Daniel is his real name, but Darwin DeJesus and I, we wrote opening statements and rebuttals, and we exchanged both of them beforehand. So we did that so that we talk past each other minimally in those, the opening and rebuttal periods, but also it gave us room to have as much open discussion as we did, because we would understand each other's views as well as possible, and give, people who were only interested in the opening statements and the rebuttals, they could listen to it for an hour and then they were good. But people who wanted to go deeper, we were going to be able to give them that clash of arguments, because he's a divine command theorist. And so the view of ethics that I have kind of roughly goes like this. So we can have things in our interests and other people can have things in their interests. And these interests can conflict. And so morality is its most interesting, and moral theorizing is at its most difficult when we try to resolve those disagreements or tensions in between conflicting interests. And so rationality requires us to reject any moral principle that is supported only by question-begging arguments. And so then I want to say that egoism and pure altruism, egoism being always prioritizing our own interests, and pure altruism being always prioritizing everyone else's interests, are supported only by question-begging arguments. And that impartial fairness avoids question-begging because it gives no arbitrary priority to any party's interests. It demands that its demands are ones that, to again circle back to Derek Parfit, everyone could rationally will, that's Kant, would make things go impartially best, that's consequentialism, Sedgwick, and no one could reasonably reject, so that's contractualism in Scanlon. And so from these three premises, it follows that when relevant interests conflict, we rationally ought to reject egoism and pure altruism and accept some form of impartial fairness. And so that the supreme principle of morality, all other moral principles follow from this supreme principle of morality, which is a principle of fairness. And so this is objective in the same way that rationality is objective. So it's an objective truth that we shouldn't contradict ourselves and that we shouldn't object or reject the conclusions of sound arguments. And so we also shouldn't treat people unfairly. And that when we act immorally, not only are we acting in a way that we shouldn't act, we are acting irrational. And so that's Kant again. And so that's broadly my moral view.
Yeah, and you can see that if you want to see it more online. I think you've posted your that initial kind of talking points for that debate.
My debate brief has it in a nice one-page little summary of what it is. Fantastic. And so, and again, this isn't unique to me. Like, this isn't material that I've been original in creating. So, I mean, this started with Plato through Kant. Sedgwick was trying to do this. This is what people like Parfit, Scanlon, Rawls, Sturba, modern ethicists, I'm standing on their shoulders. Out of all the ethical theories that I've considered and the moral philosophy that I've gone through, this is what I found to be the most compelling ethical theorizing.
Okay, I've got two more questions for us here. Wait, I actually just thought of something just now that I thought might be interesting. I want to ask this too. You had mentioned the teleological argument and experience. One of my favorite philosophers is a guy named Pierre Bayle. He's a French Enlightenment thinker, and he himself is a Calvinist. But yet when it comes to faith, he thinks it is incompatible with rationality. He thinks that you can have faith or you can have rationality, but you cannot try to put the two together. He thinks, so much the worse for rationality. Others think so much the worse for faith. Is there a sense in which how much of this debate do you think is about rationality, and what about it is super rational or non-rational? I asked that just in the context of my next question here, is about how theist and atheist, religious and non-religious people can better dialogue with each other. But I also want to know your thoughts on is faith stuff rational? Is it irrational? Is it super rational? Because I agree. I think what's interesting is I don't know very many religious people that got that way after doing symbolic logic. I don't know very many people that did that after reading C.S. Lewis. It was an experience. They felt something. They had a grandmother die. I actually kind of wonder if that happens both ways, that somebody that converts or deconverts usually happens at a major point in their life because something happened. Give me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I actually take an opposite line of Pierre Bayle on this one, much to the dismay, I think, of my atheist peers. They very much don't like me being so sympathetic and friendly to concepts of faith. But I actually think that this is an area where I've been influenced a great deal by Kierkegaard. And so I think that faith and rationality to some extent go hand in hand, in that you can't have one without the other. They're two sides of the same coin. And so why do I think that? So the easiest way to kind of flesh this out is to go back to an ancient problem called Agrippa's paradox, or what's nowadays more often called Munchausen's trilemma. So the bootstrapping analogy. So, this guy, he's stuck on his horse in mud, and so he lifts himself out of the mud by his bootstraps, and that's how he gets out of the mud. And so obviously, if you think about that, you go, okay, well, that doesn't really make sense. Well, unfortunately, kind of epistemology, Agrippa's paradox, forces us to kind of have to do something similar with epistemology. So there's this famous concept of knowledge that involves justified true belief.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think Edmund Gettier pretty successfully showed that these aren't sufficient for knowledge, but I think everyone would still pretty much agree that these are necessary for knowledge. Like,
Yes.
you can't know something unless you believe it. Can't really know it if you can't justify it. And you certainly don't know it if it's not true. So it can't be false and you know it. Well, so belief and truth can be not so interesting in this context. What's really interesting is justification. And so the question becomes, where does justification end? So is it turtles all the way down? Is every true claim justified by another true claim ad infinitum? So that doesn't seem like it's going to work. Does one claim justify another claim, and that claim justifies this claim? Well, that's just circular. And so circular arguments don't support their conclusions. So we're not going to be able to justify claims in a circle. So that's not going to work. Well, the only other options, so those are two options, there's three options. The only other options is that there's something intrinsically justifying. There's something self-evident. There's something that we just take as true without any further justification. That's just faith. So at some point, justification comes to an end. At some point, Wittgenstein has this famous saying, at some point, like I'm digging with a spade, but at some point I can dig no further. My spade is turned and this is simply what I do. And so I think that's the appropriate place. So I don't think the infinite regress can work. I don't think the circular argument can work. So this puts me in that third, what's called the foundationalist camp, where something just is intrinsically justified. And I think that's a form of faith. That there's just something that you say, okay, like if you were to ask me well, why shouldn't you believe a contradiction? Okay, well, I guess that's just what I have. Like, I have faith that you shouldn't believe contradictions.
So you're saying in a sense like the cogito even, or some sort of logical axiom, law of non-contradiction.
Yeah.
There's a sense in which you're still appealing to faith for that, even though it's irrefutable.
And so I think we're, this is what I mean by, I got to this conclusion by rationality. And I can't get out of this paradox without something like faith. So this rationality and faith are going to have to go hand in hand. Or I have to admit, knowledge is impossible. I don't know anything because nothing's justified. And so if nothing's justified, I don't meet the necessary conditions of knowledge. So all knowledge is impossible. And that seems, and even more, I would
Yeah.
much rather fall on the infinite regress or the circular argument before I go, knowledge is impossible.
Yeah.
That one just, I don't have enough faith to do that, to use the cliche
Yeah.
term. And so I'm much more sympathetic to faith, what Kierkegaard called the leap of faith or leap into faith.
Yeah.
That at some point, like, rationality will only get you so far. And then when I live my day-to-day life, I don't make decisions. There's a lot of uncertainty in life. Arguments are not the main vehicles in which get me through living life. That's not why I decided. I didn't decide to marry my wife because of a logical syllogism or because I sat down and did I took a leap of faith. And so I think that there's an appropriate place in one's epistemology for faith. Not only do I think there's an appropriate place, I think it's necessary. I think that to try to lay out an epistemology that makes no appeal to anything that looks like faith is just a fool's errand. Like, I don't think you're going to be able to do it.
Very good. Let me ask you one more question, and then we'll be done. And this has been fantastic, by the way. Again, I know you don't know me, but I appreciate you, and I appreciate you taking the time to chat with us. What are some good resources you would recommend on atheism? Maybe some primary sources and some secondary sources for people that just want to wrestle. Whether it's for my audience, I've got Christians, atheists, Jews, agnostics. I've got a bunch of different kinds of people. But for people that are more interested in wanting to learn more about atheism, other than obviously the resources at Real Atheology, what are some other resources that you would recommend for them to maybe start with?
So this is probably my favorite question because I have something of a canon that I like. So I've got a list of 10 books, but then I swear I'll just name off those books, but then I'll narrow it down to 3 to talk about. So the first is De Rerum Natura by Lucretius. So that's just, it makes you realize that materialism is something ancient. It has a rich tradition. And so that modern day materialism, naturalism, physicalism is an ancestor. It has its precursors in figures like Lucretius. And it's incredibly well written. So in ancient times, philosophy was both an art and a science, and writing was both an art and a science, and Lucretius could do both. And so it's just very well written. Obviously, a lot of it's outdated, but it's still a very, very good read. Another one is On the Nature of the Gods by Kikero. So again, we're missing a good portions of that, but still what we have fragmented is very, very good.
I'm so excited that you said his name correctly instead of Cicero. I appreciate that you used the correct Latin pronunciation. As a nerd, I appreciate that. All right,
yeah. And I'm just glad I didn't embarrass myself by saying Descartes.
Oh, you crushed it. No, you crushed it. Don't worry about that. Yeah, you don't want to do, no worries.
Theological political treatise by Baruch Spinoza. Very, very great work. That's really a precursor to what atheism as we understand it now and religious textual criticism. My personal favorite, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion by David Hume. The Essence of Christianity by Ludwig Feuerbach. Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche. So that's a classic one. The Faith of a Heretic by Walter Kaufmann. So most of the translations of Nietzsche that we have are by Walter Kaufmann. And the Faith of a Heretic is wonderful. More on the continental side of things. And so it's nice to mix things up. The Miracle of Theism by J.L. Mackie. And Logic and Theism by J.H. Sobel. And then Arguing About Gods by Graham Oppy. And so if I had to pick 3, if I had to pick one, if you could only read one of these, make it David Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. So I think that is the greatest work of philosophy ever written in English. So if you're looking for philosophy that was originally written in English, you're not going to do better than David Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. And I think all of contemporary philosophy of religion is a footnote to Hume's dialogues. If you could only read one other one, I would read The Miracle of Theism by J.L. Mackie. I think that's the most rigorous work of analytic philosophy in the atheist tradition that's still accessible. So don't get me wrong. There's a lot to be that's technical in J.L. Mackey's The Miracle of Theism, but it's not so technical that you couldn't read something like the dialogues and then follow it up with J.L. Mackey. But if you're looking for the best work of atheist philosophy ever written in the analytic tradition, any tradition, period, it's kind of the final boss of atheism is Logic and Theism by J.H. Sobel. So Sobel is a logician, and he is probably one of the most important logicians of the 20th century. And so I think this book came out in like 2004, and it's kind of his masterclass of very, very technical, don't get me wrong. But I think as far as atheistic works go, it is the most comprehensive, the most thorough, and the most forceful defense of atheism that you can find. I don't think anyone has matched Sobel yet.
Thank you so much. Super helpful. Benjamin Watkins, you gave up some of your night to hang out with us. Thank you for taking the time. Thanks for sharing that with us. I'll post some links when this video goes up where you can follow Ben online. And also what people didn't get to see is before this, it took us like 20 minutes to get set up, and we were having technical difficulties, and we were doing old school dial up, and it was beeping in our ear, but we figured it out. So I appreciate you taking the time, and thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a blast. I look forward to doing something similar in the future.
Awesome. Listen, if I'm in Virginia, I'll hit you up. If you're ever in Dallas, I'll get you a glass of Pappy's or something. We'll have something fun. So
absolutely, please do.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, and thank you for everybody tuning in. And we will see you on Ideological next time.